It doesn't take a genius to figure out that what Donald Trump wants with regard to Venezuela is regime change, because him, along with the warmongers in his cabinet, have been pushing vociferously for just that. And over the weekend, Mike Pence met with Juan Guaido and said that he can rely on the United States for uncompromising support. And when it comes to why they are interested in intervening militarily in Venezuela, well, as Andrew McCabe puts it, Donald Trump wants their oil.
Yeah, the president's remarks to the room were along the lines of, I don't understand why we're not looking at Venezuela. Why are we not at war with Venezuela? They have all the oil and they're right on our back door.
Now, I understand that that may not be persuasive, even if I do believe McCabe there, because it is hearsay. But if you need to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, then listen to no one other than National Security Advisor John Bolton tell Trish Reagan of Fox News that they're interested in jacking Venezuela's oil.
It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of the United States. We both have a lot at stake here, making this come out the right way.
So this is about their oil. They want Venezuela's oil, and they're doing whatever they can to push for regime change there. Now, the big thing that they're currently doing is they're trying to get Maduro to accept aid. Now, what a lot of people are pointing out is that this may be nothing more than a ploy, because if you offer Venezuela aid expecting Maduro to reject that aid, then what do? You set up the situation where you are pushing for a conflict, where people in the country who are part of the opposition try to get the aid, and you have maybe, a clash between the Maduro people and the Guaido people, and it's just a disaster situation. So essentially it's a trap. By offering aid, you don't necessarily care about aid. It's a trap, because let's be clear here, if Donald Trump cared about the Venezuelan people as he says he does, and he cares about humanitarian issues, then why hasn't he spoken out more forcefully about the Rohingya genocide that's going on in Myanmar? Why is he against ending support to Saudi Arabia as they carry out a genocide in Yemen currently? We know that this is nothing more than United States national interests and international hegemony, and us trying to do what we want to do simply because we can. So this humanitarian aid is nothing more than a stunt. And over the last month, what we've seen from the United States is everything they could possibly throw at Venezuela in order to not just destabilize the regime, but ultimately lead to the military turning on Maduro, which essentially means he would lose his power. His reign would effectively be over at that point, because their loyalty, the military's loyalty, is what's keeping him in power specifically. So the United States put sanctions on Venezuela, and they've been trying to do everything they can to meddle in Venezuela's affairs in order to get Maduro out and their guy in. So we need to be savvy and acknowledge that this aid is not about humanitarianism. Donald Trump doesn't care that Venezuelans are starving, and he really just wants to get them food. This is all part of a concerted effort to actually make sure that the U.S. coup in Venezuela is a success. And I think that Senator Chris Murphy surprisingly had a pretty astute take here. He says Democrats need to be careful about a potential trap being set by Trump et al. In Venezuela. Cheering humanitarian convoys sounds like the right thing to do, but what if it's not about the aid? What if the real agenda is laying a pretext for war? Follow my logic for a second. First, no secret Trump has been talking up war with Maduro since 2017, when he repeatedly asked McMaster for a plan to overthrow Maduro. New McCabe book confirms. Now, Trump says all options are on the table, and Rubio objects to Senate resolution that forbids war. I want aid to get to Venezuelans, but let's be honest, Venezuela didn't just lurch into humanitarian crisis. The aid is being sent there now as part of a regime change strategy. Many are hoping that it will be the match that lights a civil war against Maduro. Senator Rubio rushed to tweet out reports today of Maduro allies firing into Colombian territory, warning that the United States will help Colombia confront any aggression against them. Venezuela ordered Colombian diplomats out in 24 hours, ramping up the crisis. Maduro is evil, and the U.S. should pursue a strategy to undermine him and prompt new elections. No one can defend what he has done to Venezuela, but it's quite a different thing for the U.S. to insult incite a civil war with no real plan for how it ends. Sound familiar? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, go look up the 1947 Rio Treaty. It's a Western Hemisphere mutual defense treaty and may not require a war declaration if Trump is legitimately coming to the defense of Colombia. Don't think the Venezuela hawks don't know this. Now, he is flat out wrong to suggest that the United States should pursue a strategy to undermine Maduro, because we need to just stop meddling in Venezuela's affairs. Full stop. Just stop. Back out. Don't even pay any attention to what they're doing. You're only going to make matters worse. But with that being said, his call for caution is incredibly important, because he's right to be cautious here. And everything that's currently happening indicates that Donald Trump and the warmongers in his administration want war with Venezuela. And they've been trying to bait Maduro into a military conflict. Once they basically ordered the U.S. diplomats to leave Venezuela, once they recognized Guaido as the leader, well, what happened? They were basically saber-rattling against Venezuela, saying, oh, well, let's see, if they hurt our guys, if they hurt U.S. citizens there, then there's going to be an issue. All things are on the table. And then you have Marco Rubio tweeting out pictures of Gaddafi to essentially threaten and intimidate Maduro. And I mean, look, we don't even have to entertain this idea that Trump and his cronies care about the Venezuelan people, because they don't. So to even entertain it is preposterous. We know what they want. They want to get in Venezuela for a regime change agenda, to get a puppet, Guaido, in who will allow them access to their resources. That's what this is about, simply put. So this call to basically get Maduro to accept U.S. aid, it's nothing more than a red herring. It's a trap. Now, the problem is when it comes to 2020 presidential candidates, most of them are falling into that trap. Tulsi Gabbard thus far has not. However, Bernie Sanders has, and he tweeted this out. Quote, the people of Venezuela are enduring a serious humanitarian crisis. The Maduro government must put the needs of its people first, allow humanitarian aid into the country, and refrain from violence against protesters. Now, I responded saying, this is an incredibly disappointing response from you, Bernie. Don't play into the hands of warmongers like Elliot Abrams and Donald Trump. You should know better than this. And I am baffled that he doesn't seem to know better than this. And there were a lot of progressives who were furious at Bernie after he said this, and rightfully so, because look, it's one thing to not advocate for regime change wars, but you do have to be hypersensitive to whatever propaganda that the warmongers are going to throw at you. And now it's humanitarian aid. What, you're against humanitarian aid going to Venezuelans? Do you want their people to starve? This isn't about humanitarian aid. This is about Donald Trump trying to push his regime change agenda. And for whatever reason, Bernie Sanders just kind of seems to have a blind spot here. So he pissed off a lot of progressives, but understand here, what Bernie Sanders is clearly doing is trying to walk a fine line in order to not piss anyone off. And what he said in an interview with Jorge Ramos was better. I like what he said there better than his tweet, but he managed to piss off other individuals in the Democratic Party. So here's the clip, and then we'll talk about the response.
Do you consider Juan Guaido the legitimate president of Venezuela?
No, I think what has to happen right now, I think there are serious questions about the recent election. There are many people who feel it was a fraudulent election. And I think the United States has got to work with the international community to make sure that there is a free and fair election in Venezuela.
So is Nicolás Maduro a dictator, Senator, for you? And should he go?
All right, I think clearly he has been very, very abusive. That is a decision of the Venezuelan people. So I think, Jorge, there's got to be a free and fair election. But what must not happen is that the United States must not use military force and intervene again, as it has done in the past in Latin America, whether it was, as you recall, whether it was Chile or Brazil or the Dominican Republic or Guatemala. The United States has a very bad record of intervening in Latin American countries. That must not happen again. The future of Venezuela must be left to the Venezuelan people.
That was much better. Bernie. And to be fair, he did do this interview a couple of days before he made that tweet, I believe. So that's what we want to see from Bernie Sanders. We want him to unequivocally say, no, we're not going to do a regime change war because that doesn't work out for us. And second of all, we need to let the people of Venezuela ultimately decide, and I think he also did a good job at the CNN town hall when he was asked the question about why he doesn't support Maduro being overthrown, and he said, well, look, there's dictators around the world. Why aren't we overthrowing Saudi Arabia, where women are third-class citizens? So he makes a strong case. So I just wish that he would see that there are other aspects meant not for humanitarian aid, but under the guise of humanitarian aid to push for a regime change war. But with that being said, let's just stop for a moment and put ourselves in the shoes of Venezuelans. So let's say that China didn't like what transpired in 2016. They see that, you know, there is a candidate that got more votes than the person who actually assumed office. That's problematic. That's not a real democracy. The Electoral College just subverted the will of the people. Hillary got 3 million more votes than Trump, and she's not president. That's not a real democracy. So maybe the United States should call for or hold a new election. What if China called for us to hold a new election? What if Germany called for us to hold a new election? Even if we all don't like Donald Trump, understand that the consequences of foreign governments calling for us to hold new elections would be nationally destabilizing, and it would create this chaotic situation. So ultimately, the goal is to let the people decide. If we have problems with our democracy, we work it out, not you. You don't get to tell us what we do in our country. And that's exactly what's being done right now. So that's what Bernie Sanders communicated. We don't get to make that decision for Venezuela. They get to make the decision, and we need to stop meddling. So even if he was wrong about, the humanitarian aid issue, at least he acknowledges that regime change war is not acceptable. However, because he said that, because he didn't explicitly say we should overthrow Maduro, well, now centrist Democrats are pissed off with him. He just can't win. So according to this Politico article, quote, he is not going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. He has demonstrated again that he does not understand this situation. Representative Donna Shalala, a Miami Democrat who represents Venezuelan exiles, told Politico, I absolutely disagree with his imprecision in not saying Maduro must go. Shalala has filed legislation aimed at helping Venezuelan immigrants. Helena Poleo, a Democrat who's a former journalist from Venezuela and is a Spanish-language commentator, called Sanders' comments disgusting. The Florida Democratic Party needs to denounce this now. The state party made its position on Maduro clear without mentioning Sanders by name. Florida Democrats have been unequivocal. We recognize Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, denounced the legitimacy of the Maduro regime and its efforts to remain illegally in power, the party said in a statement. Its comments echoed those of Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who represents one of the largest Venezuelan populations in the United States. So, it's obvious that Bernie Sanders feels as if he has to walk a fine line to appease both sides, but here's the problem with doing that. By trying to placate your critics, Bernie, all you're doing is pissing off your supporters. Because you can't appease both sides. There's the truth, and then there's the warmongers who want regime change in Venezuela. They're specifically mad at you, Shalala is at least, because you won't say we should overthrow Maduro. So what you need to do is be forceful in opposing any and all regime change efforts in order to appease the people who matter most, your base. And he's also done this with other issues as well, because the establishment is always promoting this false narrative that Bernie Sanders supporters are bullying and harassing women. And he unequivocally condemned any and all harassment, because who wouldn't? But the reason why he did this is because establishment loyalists are trying to promote this false narrative that Bernie Sanders supporters are notorious for harassing women, when we all know that that's not true. Vox actually did an analysis back in 2016, and it showed that Hillary supporters were actually more aggressive online than Bernie Sanders supporters, and his supporters, along with John Kasich, were the more docile online, but it's clear that he's trying to placate his critics here. And as Kyle Kulinski points out, my dude, I know you're trying to placate your critics here, but you have to understand there's no appeasing smear merchants. They're going to smear you no matter what you do. Also, the premise of your supporters being uniquely cruel online is hilariously untrue. Don't feed into it. Yeah, and I totally agree. Don't feed into it, because it's not true. So they're going to smear you no matter what. If you appease them on this issue, then there's going to be something else that they're going to criticize you for. It's like playing whack-a-mole. When she goes down, another one will pop up. So you're never going to appease them. The best you can do is speak truth to power, Bernie, and represent your base, who is unequivocally against regime change war in Venezuela. The American people, even though we haven't seen polls, I take it, would be against regime change wars in Venezuela. I mean, look at what happened in Libya. Obama and Hillary Clinton overthrew Gaddafi, and now they have a literal slave trade out in the open. It's not even underground. It's not a black market slave trade. They have open slave markets in Libya. So, I mean, it's up to the people to push back. You know, and the United States can't keep doing this. They can't keep saying, well, we don't like X, Y, and Z aspects of said country, so they need to either call a new election or we're going to intervene. No, stop meddling and just ignore what's happening around the world because you only make matters worse. Now, for those of you who feel as if, you know, we shouldn't criticize Bernie Sanders, understand that we need to vocalize our disagreements with him because Bernie Sanders is unique in comparison with other politicians. He actually seems to listen. And there's just a few politicians that actually listen. Ro Khanna is one, Tulsi Gabbard is another, Bernie Sanders is basically the only senator who listens. Maybe besides Jeff Merkley, Elizabeth Warren to a degree, but she listens more to her strategists and aides. So at the end of the day, you know, Bernie Sanders, he tried to please everyone and ended up appeasing no one and pissing off everyone. So the best you can do in this situation is be bold and unapologetically progressive and say, stop meddling in Venezuela. Stop pretending that you care about aid. Stop offering aid when you know Maduro's going to reject it because he doesn't trust us. He might think that we're trying to smuggle guns into the country, you know, with aid. Just stop. You know we're not going to help. We're only going to make things exponentially worse. Just stop. So if you just said that, you'd at least not piss off your base, which is who you need the most, Bernie. So a lot of people were furious, and rightfully so, but don't be afraid to vocalize your criticisms because he listens, and that's important. But overall, this Venezuelan situation, it's going down a bad path, and I worry because there's no opposition who's really speaking out against this. I mean, you have some people in the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders and Chris Murphy, who are saying, let's stop and analyze what's happening and be nuanced. But then you have others like Shalala, who are saying, basically, oh, you don't support the overthrow of Maduro? What a horrible person you are. I mean, this is the state of discourse. If you talk about not wanting to wage a regime change war, you're demonized. Look at Tulsi Gabbard's appearance on The View. Meghan McCain called her an Assad apologist. She was grilled for not wanting to intervene in Venezuela. This is the state of affairs. There's one narrative, and if you buck that narrative, you are going to be attacked. Bernie, of all people, should know that. So just come out swinging, Bernie. Come out swinging, say no. No regime change war in Venezuela, no aid in Venezuela, because even if we want there to be aid going into the country, we already know what's going to happen. And furthermore, if other countries are giving Venezuela aid that their government is accepting, then why are we trying to give them aid when they know that we're a threat to them? Why would they be stupid enough to accept that? So that's it. You know, I just wish that Bernie Sanders would listen to us and take the right principled position that he knows deep down is right, rather than trying to appease warmongers in the establishment who will just find a different reason to smear him if he does actually appease them in any way.